the format that I could present to you all, but I ran out of time, and I was in the middle of trying to incorporate the amendments from planning and zoning a few days ago. I introduced some slides and move them around, and so that the orders are a little wrong, but because today is the only chance for a public hearing, I decided to give it to you anyway. So I apologize that it's not well organized. Maybe some slides may be duplicates too, but in there, it's not moving. Oh, there we go. Oh.
Yeah, that's what they didn't do is these buttons right there, or
Okay.
up and down, I guess.
Up and down. So there are 3 parts in here, the purpose and intent of MPZ, because I think this, especially for this zoning ordinance, the purpose and intent are like the skeleton, and whatever we add there is like flesh and blood. So this should be the backbone, so I try to understand the purpose and intent, and then there are some things that I could not understand about MPZ concept, so I lay them out, and hopefully I could understand what this is all about. So this is the first in the purpose and intent about the walkable and mixed-use community. And secondly, it was about the superior design that is better than the individual subdivisions or the commercial plans. And the third one is the environmental concerns, environmental preservation and enhance the landscape, which I just loved. So if there's something like that, I'd like to live there. And because one day I may live there, I may want to live there, I want to know what it's going to be like. So I put myself into it personally. So I looked at the models that we heard a lot about, the Eden Hill. The left is the initial plan from Becker Morgan engineering firm, and the right side is the Google map photo. So there's a animal hospital, and then multiple use townhomes underneath. And when I saw the Eden Hills, I saw it was called Traditional Neighborhood Design in Dover, and there was a plus review in 2004. It was initiated in 2005. It was in investment level 1, and Office of State Planning Coordination supported it as a mixed-use and infill project. They were totally for it. And then the development process, again, it was initiated 2005. 2008, the largest medical center of that date opened in Eden Hills. 2017, the townhouse construction started, and there are 83 units. Also, I think in September 2017, the skilled nursing facility opened. And a few months after they opened, I happened to visit there because a friend was there. This is a short-term physical rehab facility, not a long-term. And the Google map shows the animal hospital, and I think there's one more business there. But this is since 2005. Now it's about 18 years. And I hear there are some single-family homes, too, which I could not find anything about online. So that my question was, is anybody walking there? I don't think there was anybody walking there when I went there. And it looks like the medical centers and the physical rehab centers contribute to the more traffic coming in from outside instead of promoting the self-contained, walkable, bikeable community concept. So the communities that we are familiar with as old street, walkable streets, they are different from today's. Today, we have cars. We want to go everywhere, anywhere, as quickly as possible. And we have so many choices of those stores, restaurants, drugstores, medical providers, and online shopping. So today, the walkable concept is different than before. And any subdivisions we approve today, they should be walkable inside the community anyway. So I think when we talk about walkable community as MPZ, we need to think about walkable with a mixed use, like walking to the stores or walking to some other places. So how do we create the self-contained master plan zoning satisfying its purpose and intent, which is walkable mixed community with a beautiful superior design and environmental preservation? And when we select those permitted mixed use, we need to select them with the purpose and intent in mind. And commercial or professional entities, they have to be something to enhance or promote the walkability of the community residents. And they have to be developed where the infrastructure can support such large communities. And also avoid the traffic magnets that bring in traffic from outside in, because like CVS, Weiss at a Village of 5 Points, I go there because there's no CVS on the west side. And that Weiss has the best oranges. So I go there. And when I go there, the traffic going into that street, the main street, is always many cars waiting in and out. But do I see people from the 5 Point Village going to those shops? I don't see anybody walking there. So I think this concept is something that we need to think about. And so what are the traffic magnets, like gas stations, or warehouse stores, like Sam's store or BJ's, or specialty stores, or gyms, some civic areas? I mean, how many times would we walk to the Social Security office or to the library? But that will bring more people from outside into this area. Storages, the same thing. And there are some uses that are not appropriate in the residential use areas. And the reason I listed them is because the permitted use. What I see in the ordinance, draft ordinance, the one in the highlighted area, that is very difficult for me to understand what it's talking about. Only those uses that are permitted in the LI1 limited industrial district, the L2 light industrial district, and the H1 heavy industrial district shall be prohibited. So what does that mean? Is that talking about what's prohibited or what's permitted? In the zoning district, there are 3 uses: permitted use, conditional use, and special exception use. And in here it says only those that are permitted in these 3 districts are prohibited. Does that mean the conditional use or the special exception for these districts are permitted in this MPZ? I don't understand if that's what it was meaning. And another question is, then anything in C1, C3 are permitted? For instance, C3, heavy commercial district zoning code says, the district is generally intended for large-scale auto-oriented retail. What we are trying to create with the MPZ goes against this. In my opinion, that's not what we want to incorporate into the MPZ, the large-scale auto-oriented. So this is just an example of something that I don't think should be in the MPZ. So again, to satisfy the intent of the MPZ, we have to select those permitted uses carefully. The civic area concern, yes, again, those government buildings, they attract people from outside instead of serving the residents within the MPZ. The size of the MPZ is 200 acres large enough to have those stores and whatever services that would serve the residents. Oftentimes, like even CVS, and Weiss, they cannot be supported just by the community. They need shoppers from outside. On the other hand, if the community is too large, say 1,000 acres, because they want to have all kinds of stores and be supported by the residents, then it becomes too big to walk. And in that case, it could be like a little town. We're creating a little town, and they should have their own governance. And hopefully, they may have at least some trams or something to walk, to ride within the community, because it's too big to walk or to bike. So what is the optimum size of MPZ? I don't know. So here is the comparison between the Eden Hill and the Raleigh Farm that's just approved 2 weeks ago. The Eden Hills is 272 acres. Raleigh Farm, 359. And they're about the same number of dwelling units, 658 versus 646. But there's a lot more commercial space. So we're jamming in a lot of things in the small Eden Hill farm. What if Raleigh Farm applied for MPZ? How would this work as the mixed commercial and residential area? So I just threw that in to see the comparisons. And then another is the changes over time. Economy. We know that Eden Hill was stopped. It was caught by the economy. And I know another one that's Peninsula in Long Neck, and also Plantation Lakes. When Plantation Lakes was initially announced, it was for 2,800 residential homes. We thought it was a great resort. And about 50 homes were built. There were 5 builders, 5 model homes. And after 50 homes, the developers all left. And that similar thing can happen. And now still they are expanding. They didn't get to 2,800. And so in phases, they're expanding, and they're expanding the clubhouses and common areas too. So economy is one big deal. And the other one is the demographics. We have aging demographics. And 20 years from now, I may not be here anymore, or I'll be, maybe in the wheelchair. My needs will change. So what we plan today, that may not serve the community and the county in 20 years. So the technologies change, drone deliveries. If the communities have the drone, receptors or something, that may be seen as the positive. But today we don't think about that. So, there are climate changes, we may get more storms. The federal, state regulations change. I mean, a couple of years, how many times we went back and forth with the wetland, non-tidal wetland regulations. The culture changes. Like, we used to be walking because we didn't have cars. There are mom and pop stores, but we don't do that anymore. So is 20 years really a good thing to give the developers a permission to do certain things without knowing how it'll end? The prerequisite for MPZ or any high density. Well, high density means a smaller footprint for the buildings, but the parking spaces don't change. If we have a high density of 12, and still everybody has 2 cars, we have a problem. Where are we going to park? we cannot negotiate the parking spaces. So we need a public transportation. That's the prerequisite for all the high densities. Because if we have two cars and have only one parking garage, which is used as a storage, and a very short driveway, we all have to park the cars on the street. And what happens if there's a fire engines coming? You know, in our community, there was a fire one time, and there were 11 trucks and cars from the fire department. Where do they park the cars? And those trucks are big, and they are difficult to maneuver. So we need to have the public transportation. And I know it is not the Sussex County's purview. However, I think we need to advocate DelDOT to think differently. And that way we can reduce the parking space. And also, remember about a couple of months ago, the United Way Delaware came to give you the presentation on household budgets. And in there, for certain families, the transportation budget was almost as high as the housing rental budget. So if they can ditch at least one car of two in the family, they can spend that money into the housing. So I think the public transportation will solve a lot of problems. But where is the money coming from? The fees are not enough to cover it. So I keep saying we need to tap into the affordable housing grants to provide the robust and affordable public transportation. Then we can talk about MPZ or high density. And then my general comments. DENREC and OSPC both mentioned ambiguous language in the public comments. And also the amendment procedures, as Mr. Riley, you mentioned, they need to be more specific. The language we have in the draft is basically one person makes the decision. Director can make a decision whether it's a minor, major, or inconsistent with the master plan. I think the burden on one person is not a good thing. And the major, I really have a hard time understanding the major amendments and the inconsistent. I think anything major should trigger plus review and the public hearings too. And here is the OSPC comments about the ambiguous language. And I'm not going to bother you with all the details. Here's the DENREC comments about ambiguous language. And those ambiguous language could be litigated later and cause conflict. And I think we need to become more specific than general. The optional areas, again, the neighborhood commercial area and professional medical areas and civic areas, they all have the same thing. It's optional. If they're all optional, why even bother to change, to rezone? There should be some language somewhere that at least one of these have to be employed. And the location, we talked about it, AR1, level 4. The OSPC is against AR1 and level 4 for MPZs. And I think we talked about that. That's the comment. And the planning and zoning amendment. I just got it yesterday. So I looked at it and it says, self-contained development including all kinds of residential uses, retail, commercial uses, and institutional uses. So what about the road infrastructure or the schools? When we talk about the infrastructure, it's not only about small shops that we can walk to. So level 4 is still a problem because of the road infrastructure. When the construction companies start working, they bring heavy equipment. Sometimes they fill the land and bring the compacting machine to, roll, and sometimes they drop the dirt And they are heavy equipments. And before they get to, like, roll on Zoar Road, Avalon Road, we need to make sure the roads are enough to handle those equipments. And same thing with the MPZ. And it'll be even a bigger scale, probably. And the environmental preservation, DENREC had a lot of comments. They had a lot of comments. Sustainable development, key wildlife habitat, foot traffic must be minimized in the wetlands, and the open space must not include public land. That was one of their comments, and I didn't understand whether the "not" was missing in the draft by accident or that was deliberately left out. So the question is, the public-owned or government-owned land will be part of the open space for this MPZ or not? That is the question that I have about this one. And this was a DENREC comment, but that was not discussed by the Planning and Zoning Commission.
White House.
I can assist with that now, Mr. President. So this is to ensure that of the land to be developed, of the actual site itself, that the open space requirement is met. We're talking about parcels of land and tracts of land that may incorporate other public lands or envelop or surround public lands. So this was to make it clear that you couldn't utilise any existing public lands and say, well, that's already there, so we're going to shortfall on our open space requirement. This makes sure that in all cases that minimum threshold is met, if that answers the question.
So the "not" is not to be there. I mean, they count toward this requirement. So the public land can be counted as MPZ's open space? Is that what it says?
So the answer is, this talks about the ownership of the land in terms of the 10% minimum provision. Mm-hmm. So if the developer comes forward and says that 10% of the site is to be provided within the MPC and is to be open space and that threshold is met, but if of that 10% land is not owned by the developer or is included by another non-developer entity, the aim was to avoid including that in the number. That's the purpose of this.
Is that what it says? Because I thought it was totally different, the opposite.
That's not what the ordinance says. That's what.
Yes, it was not in the original draft. So DENREC said you should put "not" in there.
Well, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I don't know why Denver.
That makes zero sense. What you just said is there could be public lands right next to it that they don't own, but they can count that towards dirt percent.
They cannot. They should not.
What you said they could.
No, the original draft says they could. Original draft says the "not" with the underline. That is what DENREC added.
No.
That certainly wouldn't be the intent.
Go ahead. Go ahead. You're right.
I think in the event that scenario were to occur, Mr. President, I think that would be caught at the staff review level in any event. So the inclusion of this text it's perhaps unnecessary because that would be caught out if the applicant were failing to meet the minimum percentage. It's clarifying text that I understand the intent of it, and the suggestion is a good suggestion, but I think that if the percentage were not met, it would be caught anyway before the application was even heard. So.
The public land will not be counted in 10% requirement, right? Yeah, it's not their land, so that's, the original draft.
If it's not their land, they can't count.
Right, so that "not" has to be added in there to the original draft, because the original draft did not have "not."
I think the inclusion of this text, Mr. President, would overly complicate what is a very straightforward numerical objective. It's an interesting idea and for potential consideration, but just having the open space shall consist of a numerical percentage is very easy to implement and very easy to enforce. When we start looking into ownership and who might own what or who currently owns what, that further complicates the objective. the idea is an interesting one, isn't it?
Okay. The next one is DENREC wanted 100% of the minimum required open space to be free of wetland and standing stormwater management, and obviously that was not considered by planning and zoning either. The source water protection, I think, is very important, as you know, the saltwater intrusion and stuff we are talking about nowadays. So I think that should be considered too.
Just on that, that's not chapter 115 or chapter
89.
So yeah, it's chapter 89. So it would be governed by source water protection. So we don't need to add that in there because it's already.
Okay, thank you. The Delta Road, I think we talked about it, and I think we'll take care of it. The bond release, we have had a lot of problems with this premature bond release lately. I mean, it may have gone on before too, but nowadays we're hearing a lot because the HOAs are talking. So I think we need to make sure that we don't get into that. And the sunset and extension, we have seen that a lot too. The things should have gone dormant and sunsetted, but then they come up and say, oh, because of the pandemic, we did not do anything. Well, the pandemic was not an excuse. So I just say that we need to stick to this here. And all the HOAs, I think it's not about the governance, but it's about the participation in the future amendment, because that makes a difference. The governing documents are usually submitted to the planning and zoning before the final plans, but if there are multiple associations, who controls the board? I think that is the main issue there, because whoever controls the board, they can make the amendments without the public participation. And yeah, that's the. This is the minor, major, inconsistent with the master plan. So I think we need to be more specific. And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Jill Hicks, 37 Aintree Drive, Lewis. Just for clarification, what Yul was talking about, if you could just take a look at this, Mr. Whitehouse and Mr. Robertson, lines 252. That word "not" is not there. And that's as of this morning.
Yeah, no, because that was Denrec's comment, I think, in the plus. And we didn't have "not" in there for the. We'll look at it.
Yes, thank you. Let's see. I think I left my pack here. I am here to speak on behalf of the Sussex Preservation Coalition, its board, its allied organizations, and its membership. SPC, Sussex Preservation Coalition, is not opposed to master plan zoning. In fact, done right, this could help Sussex County resolve some of its current issues. However, in its current form, without proper vetting and review, it will limit and reduce the future positive impact this could have, and I'll give examples of that. First, this copy of the ordinance was made available online just yesterday morning, and even today some of the recommendations were not included. And so these late publications and last-minute changes seem to be too common or becoming commonplace in some of the county hearings. And I would just like to suggest that sometime we have things that are more readily available in a right amount of time. Second
Mr.
is the
President, if I could, just to clarify the date, if I could please, and my apologies to interrupt. Ms. Hicks, the ordinance was introduced by County Council on February 7th of this year and was subject to plus review in March of this year.
Right.
So the ordinance as introduced has been public for quite some time.
right,
So,
but it was not posted on your site until yesterday.
No, it's been on there since it was introduced. It's on
And under the agendas, for those of us that are watching County Council, if we went into the agenda and online, we could not see the ordinance until yesterday morning.
But it was in the introduced ordinances under county government. It was also in P&Z's land use
and
document.
it's been in the land use docket for
But
weeks.
but changes have taken place, and so if I'm going to, if I am going, excuse me, if I am going to come to this hearing and testify, I go to the agenda, and then I go to the packet that's online. That's what I refer to, because it should contain all the latest changes. But that packet was not available until yesterday morning.
Just for the benefit of the process, and it's probably helpful for everybody as well as Ms. Hicks, when the ordinance was introduced, that ordinance stays the same. It cannot be amended. That's why we have the public hearing. So the 17 pages that appear on the county's website going back to February and should have also been on the Planning and Zoning Commission's land use docket, that ordinance has not changed. And I can't speak to when the ordinance was uploaded on the County Council's land use docket. Frankly, I was working off the Planning and Zoning one. But the 17 pages haven't changed. However, what would have changed was we had the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting last Thursday, and there was a motion there. That, just because it was made last Thursday, that wouldn't have been uploaded with those suggested changes until whenever Friday or yesterday, and I can't speak for when that would have happened. Same thing with the public comments that would have come in. But I just want everybody to be clear, the ordinance text has not changed since February 27th, since day one.
But
and that's been available.
even today, you suggested deleting things.
No, because that was from the Planning and Zoning Commission's recommendation that occurred Thursday. That didn't change the ordinance. The ordinance stayed the same. It doesn't get changed until this body adopts it, if they choose to adopt it, and incorporate whatever amendments to the ordinance would happen. So that ordinance has not changed since it was drafted.
But do you understand that you had nothing on your agenda today? There was nothing posted as a packet until yesterday morning.
I can't speak to that because, I don't know when that gets uploaded by staff. But the ordinance has been unchanged and available on the county's website since probably February 28th, the day after it was.
It's not the first time I've seen it, but I went to that ordinance so that I knew I was working with the latest draft. It was not there till yesterday. So I had to go back through that again.
Okay. All I want to make clear is there's only one draft of that ordinance and it's been available.
But it was not available where it should have been available.
I know. Again,
That's why we're giving you 10 more days to comment.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. I, as you know, I emailed all of you saying this is a problem. Second, and even more important, is the timing of the proposed ordinance. If you remember, during the September 21st workshop, it was discussed that some standardization and standard location of code would be helpful. Mr. Robertson, I was the one who asked you if the minimum side yards for the cluster subdivision were 5 or 10 feet because I've seen both. I believe I've seen both. Your response was something like, this is why we need to standardize and have things in one location. On October 12th, just 5 days ago, at the end of the Planning and Zoning meeting, the Commission had a long overdue discussion about the workload of Planning and Zoning staff. The timing of this ordinance, if approved in its current state, is going to cause more work for everyone several times over. Why have taxpayers shell out money to pay the legal fees to have the MPZ code written, heard, revised, rewritten, possibly cycle through several times, and then go through the training and learning curve for the staff to internalize it? And we know change is never easy and means extra time and work on everyone's agenda, and then come back and redo it all again when the 5 workshop initiatives are framed out and completed and we're looking to standardize and put things in one place. For example, right off the bat, page 5, 115, 132, purpose and intent, line 155, quote, neighborhood that is superior in design to a standard residential subdivision. We already know that language is a problem, and that's why superior design on its own is one of the 5 initiatives. If approved, this ordinance in its current state preceding the 5 initiatives would mean an added challenge to change something that was already executed and precedents were being set. To proceed in this way is counterintuitive and counterproductive. It is not a good use of everyone's time and taxpayer dollars, and the result will once again yield something that we are already working hard to correct. To proceed in this fashion exacerbates issues that already exist, but on a larger scale. Certainly, MPZ should be in everyone's mind as we start down the path of prioritized initiatives, but it is disconcerting on so many levels to get ahead of these 5 initiatives, especially because Ordinance 2305 contains the same vague and problematic language that is currently seen at issue and is being addressed. At the very least, buffers, perimeter and interior buffers in this case, as well as open space, forest preservation, and superior design should be taken care of first. Also, the words consistent and consistency were mentioned numerous times in this ordinance's presentation to planning and zoning. With the vague and problematic language currently contained within, the only thing that will be consistent is the misuse of such language, which is one of the very things you have rightfully and decidedly set out to correct. One of the last statements on the presentation to P&Z on September 14th stated, quote, insert confirmation that any MPZ will be subject to the resource buffer requirements, end quote. Is it safe to assume that any progress made on forest preservation, open space, perimeter buffers, superior design, and site work will be considered for future MPZ applications? And if so, when? How many MPZ approvals will be granted before the 5 initiatives are resolved and made a part of the MPZ code? Again, what does that mean for precedents? And because these projects could take 20 years or more, the example is Eden Hill, it should be expected that changes to the master plan, the implementation plan, the master manual, and the spatial distribution plan will be needed at some point. If this ordinance is approved in its current form and then amendments made, how will they be applied to the future necessitated changes? Some specifics. Page 7, line 207, states that residential density will not exceed 12 units per acre. And maybe this is just me being confused, excluding tidal wetlands. Is that the only natural resource to be excluded? What about future forests and other natural protections? Does that mean if I have a parcel of 210 acres, 10 acres are tidal wetlands, and 20% must be non-residential, that I could build 2,400 residential units on 160 acres, which means I could build 12 units per acre, and sometimes more depending on the features and on each viable acre and so forth. So is it or is it not exactly 12 acres per unit? In fact, it will be much more when you add open space and amenities. By the way, the open space in the slide that was used as an example doesn't seem to line up with the requirement and shows much more than a developer will use. That was much more than 10%. Page 7, 115-135B1, words like shall follow an environmentally sustainable approach to development, and words like whenever possible, those words are bulldozed by developers. In fact, they'll say their plan is superior in design with no substantiation and is deemed so because they said so. The public questions and challenges these statements, but they fall on ears that currently demonstrate no sense of entitled discernment. They are entitled to that discernment and authority. Thankfully, the Commission is getting better at establishing conditions, and the public is getting better at requesting them. But as you know, the public has been told we have no expertise, so our statements are meaningless in such areas. One reason the language, the quote-unquote language, is so important. Page 8, 115-135B3. Publicly accessible open space outside individual lots comprising 10% of the land area shall be provided in the MPZ. In the example above, that means 21 acres will be open space, and further on, 1/2 of that, or 10.5 acres for 2,400 units, has to be free of wetlands and stormwater ponds to be readily accessible for active and passive recreation. That's a question. Then it goes on with more ambiguous language, some words about contiguous and interspersed. This needs to be addressed first. 115-135B5. Basically, it says landscape plantings will have a positive visual impact. How are you going to interpret that and enforce it? Developers say, our plantings will have positive visual impact. End of story. And then we have what is going on now, for example, with buffers. And lastly, on specifics, I find it contradictory that this ordinance will not include stronger mandates around workforce housing. Incentives and mandates should be built into the ordinance. This is a golden opportunity because this ordinance targets the coastal and growth areas where workforce housing is in demand. Developers are looking forward to this. Another concern for the purpose of fiscal responsibility is that MPZ should be limited to state investment levels 1 and 2. Because of the added density per acre and the extra burden on schools, emergencies, and roads, MPZ should only be considered where state funds will support it. I am also discouraged on a larger scale that state comments about MPZ were largely ignored. These statements need to be reviewed, considered, and included. Another concern, and this is with the MPZ presentation, Eden Hill in Dover was used as an example, and one of the large medical buildings was shown as a representation. We saw that here today. If you could have zoomed out on that picture, you would see underdeveloped, graded land set aside for non-residential use. And there it sits. Eden Hill was approved somewhere between 2003 and 2005 when it started, 20 years ago. Have you been to Eden Hill? In my previous life, I was a real estate manager for Wawa, locating, negotiating, and designing commercial sites for stores in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Connecticut. So I rode Eden Hill on Sunday, as I would have other commercial sites and MPZs, like Columbia, Maryland, at the time. Eden Hill will probably only amount to a medical park with high density surrounding it. Its commercial value is lost. Did you know that within a half mile there is a CVS, a Walgreens, and across the road a Royal Farms? I have no idea what its retail anchor is going to be or if there will ever be one. In fact, next to Eden Hill is a Kraft Heinz production warehouse facility. At this late date, Eden Hill's status is lacking clarity and purpose, and the progress has been dreadfully slow. Old for lease signs are throughout the site, both commercial and residential. By the way, Eden Hill rents out not just multi-family units. They are also renting out single-family homes. The signs are up. Eden Hill is not the model. There are better models that need to be studied. MPZ is too important to rush through its vetting process, the wordsmithing, and the hearings it deserves. At the very least, the 5 initiatives in the future land use map and the MOU for the state need to be further along before taking this ordinance any closer to the line. By the way, also one other comment on some of the discussion is stores like grocery stores, pharmacies, large retail stores like a Target, they need major arteries. You won't get them inside of an MPZ. They can't survive there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment?
Schaefer.
I actually do know a lot about Eden Hill. I quite frankly think that the design, the functionality, and the aesthetics of that project in Dover are very poor. And I I think that's the responsibility of the engineering firm that designed it, quite frankly. I'm not here to pick a fight with them. But, I think it's a very poor design. I think everybody needs to realize that Mr. Robertson and the planning department kind of used the Dover template as a basis to work from, to build a ordinance that we can adopt. Dover is much different than Sussex County. The economic conditions, the demographics are much different an hour away than they are here in Sussex County. They are not apples to apples. So I don't want anybody to get bogged down that we're going to build another Eden Hill in Sussex County, because that wouldn't be my intent with this ordinance. I can't say it loud enough, and I know the developer of Eden Hill, and he may call me tomorrow and ask me why I was criticizing him, but it's a poor design. It's aesthetically, it is terrible. And that is not what we're trying to build here, I don't think. I can't speak for anybody else up here, but that's not what we're trying to build. So let's not get bogged down in that's what we're going to build in Sussex County, Delaware, because that's not my intent. And I don't think, I'm pretty damn sure that's not the planning office's intent either. So that's my 2 cents.
Great. Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Gentleman sitting back there, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. President and members of County Council. I promise I will be brief.
Could we have your name and address first, please?
My name is Jeff Siemens. I'm a resident of Sussex County in Milton. I'm a former registered landscape architect and land planner. While I support the concept of this master plan zone ordinance, I have grave concern regarding 2 features. First, while page 16 states that, quote, detailed plans of existing natural features showing topography, soils, drainage, and vegetation shall be included as elements of the implementation plan, page 7 states, quote, the design for the entire zone shall follow an environmentally sustainable approach to development. To accomplish this, the design shall take advantage of natural drainage patterns on site and minimize, and I repeat that word, minimize unnecessary earth moving, erosion, tree clearance, and other disruption of the natural environment. Existing vegetation and habitats shall be preserved wherever possible. I emphasize the word minimize, and today, standing here before you, I predict that future developers and their engineers will say that they, quote, minimized unnecessary tree clearance, regardless of how many acres of forest are removed on the master plan. They will still claim that they did their best to minimize. This concern is also mentioned in the Plus review. Clearly, with the gift, and I mean this as someone who has spent 42 years in this business, the gift of 12 units per acre, there could be more restrictive language from the government side about preserving existing forest, especially with this being one of the 5 important topics discussed at the recent September workshop. My second grave concern is the lack of language concerning whether or not these 200-acre plus projects with 12 units per acre will end up in level of service areas 3 and 4. If they are, you as members of council will have exacerbated the traffic stress, and that's what we are experiencing in so many areas now, the traffic stress that has only gotten worse. On the first page of the plus comments, it says the state supports the use of this ordinance in coastal developing commercial and town center land use categories only. With that said, the county should consider if this ordinance should be restricted to specific zoning categories within the future land use areas noted above. It is recommended that this ordinance not be supported in the AR-1 areas or in the strategies for state policies level 4 areas. I ask you, I plead with you today to hit the pause button on this ordinance until these issues and others that have been addressed before me have been addressed. And I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else like to speak?
Back here. Somebody.
Someone
come forward.
Yeah, come up.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, members of the council. Jeff Stone from Milton. Thank you for this opportunity. We sent you I'm representing Sarge. We sent you our document. You have it. I'm not going to read it to you. Just a couple of quick comments to emphasize some stuff. What they said. We would support virtually everything that was said by the previous speakers. We think there's lots of issues here. The complexity of this proposal and the fact that it will impact the county's development for 20 years are the critical factors why Sarge is calling on the county to just hit the pause button. You just heard that term before, and obviously we've spoken, but on finalizing this legislation, not because we oppose it. We strongly support the concept. Sarge is concerned this proposal is just not as concise or detailed as it needs to be in order to be successful. And the council, and we outlined a lot of our stuff in what we sent you yesterday. As with any multifaceted legislation, the process must not be hurried. A long-term issue in drafting legislation in Sussex County seems to be, and far too much is left up to interpretation, usually by representatives of developers under the guise of being flexible. A couple of quick other things. Beyond all the issues that have been raised, one that I didn't raise and I didn't hear here today is roads. And one thing that the legislation says is that it must be located on an existing or planned arterial or collector, okay? And that's fine, except is that existing road adequate? And what will be the requirements to get it there? Will it just be the TIS and the frontage? What about going out miles? This is thousands of units, tens of thousands of commercial square footage potentially on a road that is defined but may already be overused or may be inadequate. And how far out? How are you going to work with DelDOT to make sure that this thing works? The other issue is a planned arterial or collector. Well, we've heard about DelDOT's plans for roads, and you have approved, many developments have been approved based on their plans, and their plans take 5, 6, 8, 10 years, Route 24. I mean, you know them all, and you see the issues. You cannot let that happen with a development of this scale. You see what happens with just regular subdivisions. I think it is a big issue that needs to be addressed. Again, we had outlined all the others. Let me just check my notes real quick. The question of multifamily, I just wanted to say it publicly so that somebody's on the record. We don't know why it's requirement of at least 20% of multifamily dwellings should be set aside, SCRP or otherwise. It is our opinion that requirement that it be limited to multifamily units could lead to the creation of buildings or neighborhoods of just moderate low-income families, the exact opposite of what this type of development seeks to create. It's our opinion that in return for the scale, the density, and other benefits that are being afforded to developers that will utilize this type of development, 20% of all housing, single family or multifamily, should be whether it's SRC, SCRP, or some form of affordable workforce-type housing should be in these developments due to their scale. This will prevent the concentration of low and moderate income families in single locations, provide for greater diversity throughout the development. We think that is very important. Finally, we want to thank you for the 10 days, but you've heard a lot of issues, and time is needed for the staff and the public to review these issues, potentially discuss these issues. We're not suggesting that the county stop work on this ordinance. It's quite the contrary. Applause, keeping the record open while further analysis is carried out, would allow the council and the public to take a deeper dive into the ramifications of this type of development and have more discussion on how to proceed. This is not the time to rush the finalization of a flawed document. There is no upside to hurry. This has tremendous potential benefit for managing growth, for improving the quality of land use and development in Sussex County. This zone will be with us for a long time, 20 years or more. We must make every effort now to make sure that it's the best we can be. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for referencing other comments without necessarily repeating them. Is there anyone else that would like to speak, ma'am?
Hi, my name is Cheryl Siskin. I believe I addressed you once before, but I'm going to just quickly run through my resume a little bit so I have a little more credibility with you. I, too, am AICP, although I didn't maintain it once I went to law school. I did real estate litigation. I authored a book, PUDs in Practice, in the 80s, which talked about planned unit developments and what made them successful and what made them fail. I was a rezoning coordinator in Fairfax County during the heyday of its development. During that time, actually, speaking of workforce housing, Fairfax had implemented an affordable housing ordinance, and speaking to what Jeff just said about single-family housing, county employees couldn't afford to live in the county, in often case. So they were allowed developers to build townhouses for affordable housing units. They had to look identical from the outside, but the developers were allowed to change the fit and finish on the inside so that the affordable housing units were indistinguishable from the non-affordable housing, and there was a fully integrated community. I wrote my master's thesis on pedestrian pathway design. I have a concentration in community planning and design. I worked on a project called McNair Farms, which was over 400 acres, over 1,000 units, 1,500 square feet of retail space next to an employment center. That project changed materially over the 20 years. You can look it up. It's in Fairfax County. It ties exactly to what some of the other speakers said. We have to be able to adapt to change. One of the new things that we haven't even started considering is the different types of vehicles that are going to start being created. We see e-bikes. There's a plethora of them everywhere now. There's going to be other types of vehicles, electric vehicles, that we need to plan for and we should accommodate, because we should try to get away from the single-family house using 2 cars and driving to go even to Wawa. One of the issues in Fairfax County that we used to consider when allowing for someone to use a master plan zoning ordinance such as this is whether they consolidated enough parcels that it makes sense. Sometimes people were sent back to the drawing board or the negotiating table to encourage them to bring in more lots so that it did fit as an entire community. Another consideration that I didn't see in the text of this is to consider how that community will fit with the existing community, how it ties in. For example, is there retail right across the street that could serve the residents in here, but maybe there's not adequate civic support, for example. I think the example that was given about civic use is right on Route 9, where there's a Social Security office in the middle of a residential complex that creates a whole lot more traffic into that development than might have been anticipated because it serves the entire county. There are many words that are ambiguous and subjective in here. The plus ordinance reviews a lot of them. I'm not going to repeat them, but I do think that they should be taken very seriously. One of the things, again, in Fairfax County, they had a rezoning. They tried to change one of the rezoning districts. Their only intent was to delete no office uses in light industrial uses. That hearing, it passed, so they thought. They ended up in years of litigation, and it turns out they made a mistake in the record by going through it too quickly. And it ended up that use was again permitted in that industrial zone, which was contrary to what they wanted. I think that we need to do more to make pedestrian and bike paths the top priority in this county so we get more cars off the road. I personally live, I didn't give you my address, I'm sorry, I'm in Mr. Schaefer's district. I live at the Tides. I'm fortunate enough to be right on the trail. I'm fortunate enough to have days that I call no drive days. I can run my errands on my bike or I could walk, and it's wonderful, and I feel better as a result. I think that's the goal here, is for people to live in places where if they have to run an errand, they could walk or drive or appreciate nature. I agree with Mr. Schaefer's comments about Eden Hill. It, to me, it was designed by an engineer and not by a planner or somebody that had a focus on design. Pedestrian pathway design, in order to encourage people to walk, you need to have visual cues or points of visual interest. Having a concrete sidewalk along a road is not creating a pedestrian pathway. That's a sidewalk. That's all it is. It's a way for people to get from A to B. It's not encouraging people to walk to run their errands or ride bikes. Going through the zoning ordinance itself, on page 5, I'm not going to repeat the comments, but I do want to reiterate that I support the comments that were made about superior in design. You say the purpose and intent is to preserve and enhance the natural landscape and buffer the development from adverse external influences, but you don't talk about integrating it with external influences. We have to think more regionally. And where is the priority in the purpose of intent for pedestrian and bike access and all other alternative vehicles? There's all kinds of scooters already, right? We see those things with the wheels. I don't even know what they're called. One of the problems with internal commercial use is if there's not enough people to live there, then you can't keep a successful business in there. On the other hand, if you want a really successful business, you have to attract outsiders. Look at Sydney's. It's on Cave Neck Road, right? That attracts a lot of people from outside because they have music. It's off to the side. I think that's actually a well-developed plan. But you have to consider that that's going to happen. That if you have a really good restaurant in the middle of a neighborhood, people are going to want to come from outside of that community. And that restaurant, in order to be successful, probably needs to draw from beyond the community. I think 200 acres is too small. The land area shall have access, just what Jeff was just talking about. You can't have density on a collector road. The collector road needs to be internal to the subdivision. These bigger projects should be on an arterial. And I would also propose that we have enough arterial roads already laid out if we want to widen some of the existing ones to handle capacity, but we shouldn't just be creating more roads to facilitate cars. We've got to start thinking about the future and what transportation is going to look like. Somebody also talked about the natural drainage patterns. I believe that some of the existing drainage patterns get changed when the adjacent property clears their land. So then suddenly you have a natural drainage swale that might be created through my parcel because my neighboring parcel cleared their land. So that becomes a natural drainage pattern, but it's not necessarily the ideal drainage pattern or what makes sense when, again, integrating it into the whole community. I think somebody talked about on page 8, lines 239 to 247, where you talk about wherever possible and practical. these terms are too vague and too easy for developers to find a way around. Oh, I forgot to mention, besides being a rezoning coordinator, I then became a developer myself in Fairfax County, and I encouraged my developer to save trees and do BMPs and nice pedestrian pathways, and he was able to make more money designing it like the intent here than he did in the rigid, like the Eden Hills style design. But we have to focus on preserving what's wonderful about this county. You drive through and there's stands of trees that need to be preserved. There's whole acreage that's been plowed down. Those acres, people I hear plow their land because they want to be able to sell it to a developer. If you plow your land, you shouldn't be entitled to this thing, this density, this open space, and increased density, unless you have mature trees or wetlands or some environmental area that you're going to preserve for the benefit of all of us. You talk a little bit about fire separation. I'm not sure why that would be in this ordinance. My guess is it's covered by your fire codes. But one thing I wanted to mention that's not in here, Newcastle County recently adopted a requirement for all buildings to be single-family and multifamily units to have EV-ready charging stations. We should require that in these kind of areas in particular. The plus comments included a walk-up suggestion, which I think is also very good to encourage pedestrian access. And I reiterate the comment about each of the three other uses besides residential are optional. You should be requiring at least one of them, or it makes no sense. I think the open space requirements should be far greater than 10%, 20 or 30. Most of the successful plans that I've been involved with have been closer to 30%. I'm not sure you remember, Mr. Moore, from when you took the bar exam, but one of the things when people buy into when people buy into a subdivision, they buy into a common plan, and you have a vested right in the development being built like that. So any changes have to be consistent with that plan, or you perhaps are infringing on someone's land rights once they've already bought in. Just running through. Native plant materials should be encouraged, not just plant materials. And native and valuable. I believe that Stephanie Hansen is working on some legislation to further expand on some of the work she's already done. And I also think that lines 235 to 240, where DANREC is suggesting a 100-foot vegetative buffer, I think that that should be far greater in particular areas, and it should be an at least 100. I think that covers all my comments.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hutt, your hand was up a moment ago.
I just have to be shorter than Mr. Robertson, right? Good afternoon. For the record, my name is David Hutt, local attorney here in Georgetown with the law firm of Morris James. I just want to begin at the outset by noting, and I said something similar to the Planning Commission, and I've said things similar here, your zoning code, all your land use tools, whether it's the state strategies map, the future land use map, the comprehensive plan, your zoning code, they're all part of the toolbox that land use planners, some of the folks who've testified here this afternoon, all use when doing this. And my concern, to be clear at the outset, I support the addition of this section of the zoning code. My concern is that it's the tool that somebody buys that looks good but sits there and collects dust and never gets used. And so my comments are intended to help hopefully try to put this, again, a good ordinance has the right guardrails, but allows flexibility to land use professionals to work within its constraints and get something that is superior. And frankly, the county, in my mind, has seen, I mean, this ordinance is replacing the vacation retirement residential park district. Again, that's an indication of a tool that obviously sat and collected dust and was never used. Similarly, and this is a more recent experience, and there is the C4, and that was already amended once because, as it happens, I believe the bumpers or the guardrails that were in that ordinance were too restrictive, and it turned out that it was not going to be a tool that anybody can use. I understand through Mr. Whitehouse's office that there are 2 current pending applications, one that may no longer be C4, but there are 2 pending C4 applications, so the county does have that in the works now. But again, I think that it was thought that that would be a commercial RPC like the residential RPC, and that you would see those on a more frequent basis. But because of certain basic eligibility requirements, they were not able to be utilized as effectively as one might have thought. And my comments today are going to be related to those eligibility requirements. Most of the other specific textual concerns the Planning Commission addressed through their process. And first, I wanted to note, with respect to eligibility requirements, the concern about the types of areas in the future land use map that these would apply. As you know, there's 4 growth areas that are shown. Mr. Robertson reviewed that when he introduced this. And the concern that I have is there are many areas of the county where there are public utilities and infrastructure available that may not be in one of those designations. In addition to that, if you have a project of this size, that project will be addressing those infrastructure concerns. They're self-contained, I believe, was the phrase that was used. And certainly, this is a change of zone application. If somebody were to bring this forward, it's a change of zone. And if council doesn't think it's appropriate, they can certainly act in that fashion and deny that change of zone request if you're not going to agree that that's an appropriate location for whatever reason. And as I said at the Planning Commission meeting, with the 4 areas that are designated there, it seems to me that Western Sussex County gets a little left out. There's only the 4 growth areas that are acknowledged there, and of course the coastal area doesn't exist in Western Sussex County. So you're down to 3, and if you look at the future land use map, you'll see that you're limited even further to those options. And if someone had a large-scale project in Western Sussex County, you'd want this tool to be available to them because it does allow for better planning and better use. So that's the base eligibility requirement, and I know those comments were reflected in the minutes of the Planning Commission meeting as well as some of the parts of their recommendation. The second item that I wanted to address was the affordability component. Universally, everyone knows that not just in Sussex County, but nationwide, and I'd imagine internationally, affordable housing is a very difficult issue, and I don't think anyone has come up with the silver bullet answer as to how to provide more affordable housing. And I support the amendment that was in the Planning Commission's recommendation. I think everyone hopes that the amendments to the Sussex County rental program will mean that it gets utilized more frequently, but that's still untried and untested. And until you know that something's successful, I don't think you want to strap this new ordinance with something that could prove to be a detrimental effect. And again, leave that as the tool that nobody uses. The last area that I wanted to address was the percentages that are found within there. And there's been a couple comments this afternoon that have made me wonder. I actually went back and looked at the ordinance while I was sitting there because there was requirements that things were optional. And as I understand the base eligibility requirements found at lines 204 to 206, at least 20% of the land has to be used for a non-residential use. And so it is not, I don't believe it is optional. You can certainly mix and match among the non-residential uses, but as I understand it, it is not optional. But the concern that I would have is that the minimum there of 20%. If someone were to have just the bare minimum here of 200 acres for this project, that would mean that 40 acres of it would need to have a non-residential use. If that's a commercial use, and now I'm going to reference Mr. Lardner's memorandum, and I believe he'll be submitting written comments. He's going to take advantage of the time period. He had another commitment, but as he noted in his September 25th letter to the Planning Commission, a rule of thumb would be that you can get 10,000 square feet of non-residential use on an acre of land. And he did the math for me since he's an engineer. But on a 200-acre parcel, 40 acres, that's 400,000 square feet of commercial, or it doesn't have to be commercial, but non-residential use. It could have more than a commercial component. It certainly could be a civic or professional office or something along those lines. But bear in mind, that's just the minimum. If that's a 200-acre site, you double those numbers. If someone had a 400-acre tract of land, now you're at 80 acres of non-residential use and 800,000 square feet of whatever that is. And I would posture that there are very few places, and maybe none, in Sussex County where that 400,000 square foot figure or the 800,000 square foot figure would be an appropriate mixture for a project like this. And that's where I come back to those percentages, and there was discussion during Mr. Robertson's comments about the civic portion of it, because if someone had the right location, it may be that the civic portion was a larger percentage, and that impacts all of these other percentages. Certainly, I think that the 10% figure on the maximum for the civic area should be deleted. I also think that the 20% figure, which is the minimum amount of non-residential use, should be modified or removed. I believe Mr. Lardner in his memo said that it should be removed. And there's also a maximum, of course, on the non-residential use of 50%. But as I said earlier, this is a change of zone. Council doesn't always adopt a change of zone application. People file change of zone applications. They go to public hearings before the Planning Commission for a recommendation and then come here in front of this body. And the council gets to make a decision. Is that the right location? Has it been integrated into the surrounding area appropriately? And I would say that same freedom that now is proposed for the Sussex County rental program, where the county looks at it and says, this project is of this magnitude, it addresses affordable housing sufficiently, or it doesn't. We'd like to see a stronger portion of this be devoted to affordable housing. I would say that same type of flexibility is necessary with respect to the amount of non-residential uses, the types of non-residential uses, so that it's not that tool that no one uses. And one thing that's somewhat unique about this is oftentimes, and I've heard Mr. Moore say it at this body, I've heard Mr. Robertson say it at the Planning Commission, with a change of zone, if I want to change the zoning classification of a property from AR1 to B2, council makes an up-down vote on that. At the end of the day, there's no conditions that are allowed, and as council has reminded me on numerous occasions, that anything that's in that list of permitted uses within that zoning classification is eligible, irrespective of a conceptual site plan that I may present as part of an application. That's not the case with this change of zone. This is a change of zone where the council, through all of the various plannings and manuals, is going to have a hand in exactly how that rezoning occurs and the conditions for it. In many respects, it's much closer to being akin to a conditional use, where you get to craft that zoning classification to exactly what it is that you want that vision to be moving forward. And that's the discretion that I think should be afforded, whether it's the affordable housing issue, whether it's the mixture of commercial or non-residential uses that is within the code. And I think if you put all of those things together and allow for that, which I think it does if you were to remove those percentages, I think you have a tool here that wouldn't be unused at the end of the day and sit there and be neglected like the vacation retirement residential park district has been. You have a tool that people could use moving forward, and I know that all the bodies have mentioned, whether it's the Planning Commission or County Council, that sometimes you can look at the tax map or look at the future land use map and see that you're going to see a series of applications on this area of the county, and this would allow that to be done in a holistic regional fashion that would benefit the county, its residents, and then anybody that comes in to whatever that new project is. Those are all my comments this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you.
Can I ask Mr. Robinson a question?
Sure, Mr. Shaver. Mr. Roberts, come up here, please.
So I think Mr. Hutt's example of the 20% non-residential component is pretty sobering when you listen to his layman's explanation. And was there any wiggle room at the Planning and Zoning Commission level to modify that?
The microphone, you put your mic on. That's okay.
I got to say that all over again. No, I'm just kidding.
I can do that if you want me to.
No, I got it. No, the question was, just for the record, whether there was any sort of, I think, consideration or wiggle room on that 20% number at planning and zoning. The short answer is no. But I would say there was discussion about it in the drafting stage of this. That's certainly something that's up to debate. Or consideration. I don't know if debate's the right word. But
like I said, his layman's explanation was pretty sobering.
Yeah, and we've talked about that as well. Kind of what I mentioned when Ms. Hicks testified and questioned the ordinance, that was in there from the time it was introduced. We realized that potentially that number might change, but since it was introduced, we couldn't change in that project, but that or in that process. But that's certainly something that can be considered, whether it's appropriate. And Mr. Hutt had brought that to our attention after it was introduced as well. But again, we left it there because that.
Listen, one other thing while you're up here. I think I heard someone say, and this is not a criticism, this is just an observation, that perhaps you and staff did not take all the state agency comments into consideration. And I know the answer to that in fact you have, but I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that you took the state agency's comments very seriously and took them into consideration.
We did. And I'll elaborate on that. That's sort of a good segue to a point I wanted to make. And it actually ties in a little bit with what Mr. Hutt said. So we went up to the PLUS meeting, and Mr. Whitehouse and I gave a presentation that wasn't unlike the one that I did. And that, frankly, there wasn't a lot of comment at the meeting itself. We got the PLUS letter back from them, and there were recommendations, and we did consider this, certainly we did. The one thing, though, that I think is important to keep in mind with regard to those PLUS comments, and actually some of the comments that we received today, and I think this may help going forward as we consider this ordinance, a lot of those comments I think apply if we're dealing with a straight subdivision. We are going through the process of everything we talked about at the workshop, because that deals with subdivisions. And as you know, subdivisions come into planning and zoning, you don't see them, and the developer says, I check this box, here's why, and I check that box, here's why. Subdivision, there's the least amount of discretion, and people are right, the developers come in and say, I've done it, and that's the presentation. And I don't want to say that's the end of the story, but that's kind of close to it on a subdivision. You get to conditional uses, you have a little more discretion whether you're going to be able to approve or deny them, and you can put conditions on them. On this one, it probably has the most discretion that the county has ever had on a development. And the reason I say that's important, I don't want to get bogged down on, whether it's specific on what type of natural area should be preserved, that's said in the ordinance. Because remember what I said at the beginning, through that master manual, you all are establishing the ordinance for this development. You're kind of doing what we're talking about in those workshops, but on a micro level for this development. So if somebody comes in and says that, we've got a project and there's these woods over here, you can say those woods have to be preserved and make the details on that and make that part of the master manual and the condition. And that applies to whatever it may be, whether it's wetlands or, a pond or whatever. You have the most discretion possible as a county on this. That's why it's a collaborative effort. There's no expectation that the developer is going to come to planning and zoning or you all and make a presentation and you all say, okay, and just live with it or deny it. the expectation is there's going to be engagement first with staff on the project and, the plus, and then planning and zoning. Planning and zoning is going to make, recommendations for changes in conditions. Then you all are going to actually put your stamp on it that this is what it's going to be. And it may look a lot different from the way it started when it first came to plus or to staff. But those are the kinds of things that you all have the discretion to do if this MPZ. I'm not advocating for it. I'm trying to explain the process and distinguish it between the subdivision
So these
and this.
will always come to council? because
Always
of the
come to
change of
council.
zone.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a two-step process, approval process, and
Well, and it's
Council will have
different. It's a
final.
change in zone with conditions, and so the conditions are as limited to, like I talked about, you got to preserve this area of forest, or as expansive as I want you to rewrite this chapter in your master manual to say X, Y, and Z. It gives you all. It's a responsibility that falls on your shoulders, frankly, to be engaged in this development process. But at the end of the day, you get to really control that, which is different than what we talked about with the subdivision, because the subdivision, you got to change the whole subdivision code. That's kind of the big monstrosity of a process we're trying to go through, code-wide right now. Here, it's project-specific.
I want to be clear on what Mr. Hutt said about the 20% non-residential, right? It's not 20% commercial that's required, it's just non-residential?
Right, and the idea being that, again, it's kind of what I was talking about, that we don't get an entirely residential MPZ. So at least 20% of it has to be, either the neighborhood commercial, the civic, or the office, financial, and medical area.
What about open space? Is that part of that calculation, or?
No, because that would be considered non-residential. Maybe that's something we could specify, but that again is designated so that 20% of it has to be one of these other types of use, because there's a separate requirement for the open space of 10%.
But did you also say 10% for civic?
There was a cap at 10% of civic.
10%.
Yeah. And then none of those non-residential uses can exceed 50%. So I think Mr. Hutt's point was take off the 10% because you're always still capped at the 50%.
So allow it to go down as low as 10%? As a minimum?
That's up to you all. The 20%, you could allow that to go down to 10% or 15% or whatever. The civic, I think his point was take out the 10%. So then you could have, frankly, no civic, or you could have up to 50% of the whole thing being civic if you wanted to.
And civic being just governmental, or?
No, the civic is actually
recreation, libraries.
You're right. It is government, but it's education buildings, also libraries, meeting halls, museums, recreational facilities, places of worship, or other similar civic, social, or cultural uses.
Public buildings.
Yeah, exactly. So it could be anything from public uses to cultural uses, or recreational uses.
But the suggestion on native plant species probably is a good one.
And again, that's something we can clarify in here, but I don't want you all to lose track of the fact that if it's in here or not, you all, if one of these comes forward, get the opportunity to say, well, this is what the native plant species have to be, and where
I
they're
think
going
the
to go.
more things you can anticipate, the less chance of
No, that's
an
true.
oversight.
That's true.
That's
true.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
You've already had your opportunity to speak. Anyone else like to speak? Is there anyone else? And
come on down, ma'am.
Yes.
You.
Hello, my name is Judy Rose Seibert. I reside on Ocala Way in Lewis. And first of all, I'd like to say that I am definitely in favor of these master plan zones. However, I do have concerns, like lots of other people, especially since the master manual design guidelines will prevail over Chapter 115 and Chapter 99. And so if you, as has been already mentioned, if you do make some changes subsequent to the 921 meeting and they're incorporated in Chapter 115, they won't apply to this master plan zone. So what I'd actually like to ask you to do is to amend this ordinance so that particularly some like superior design and buffers be addressed in this master plan zone before it goes forward. Let's see. I also would like to, I don't know if you, as you considered in 921, if you were considering a site evaluation prior to, for forest and other natural resources. And I would like to see there be an addition of some percentage of forest retention, particularly mature forest. I also would like to see that there be a percentage of native plant species be added to it, say 50% or something. In some ways, we have this beautiful Sussex County. This is why I moved here. And we are removing so many of the plants that sustain the animals that lived here. So by making a requirement for native plant species, those are the species that feed the wildlife that we want to have retained here. I also think that the minimum of 10% open space is just way too small. Here you have, and I would like to see actually that you be presented with a different diagram, one that shows what 10% open space actually looks like, because the diagram you saw was, I don't know, 25%, 20% open space, and it gives you a very different view of what it would be like. So think about all those, 12 housing units and all the kids in there and the areas that they're going to have to play in, or the forest that they may be able to have a trail to walk through and grow up as I did, and I know most of you did. I would also like to echo that this should only be allowed in level 1 and 2, or possibly 3, but definitely not 4, because of the impact on the roads and because no one is going to improve those roads that are in the level 4 land in between these, these developments. Let's see. Oh, also, can you pull up that diagram again, please? Yeah. So I assume the blue is the stormwater management ponds. That just seems way too small for any development that I've ever seen come through, planning and zoning or county council before us. So I think, I really don't think this is a very representative drawing of what such a development would look like. And the last, I know that in some recent planning and zoning approvals, they've required downlighting. I would like to request that downlighting be added to this ordinance, and that it be throughout the MPZ, because we are, being where we are, Delaware, we are on a major migratory pathway, and uplighting disorients birds during migrations. And just for an instance, recently, within the last couple of weeks, there were 1,000 birds that struck one building in Chicago and died. There were 1,000 birds littering the sidewalks around that building. So anyway, anything that we can do to mitigate effects of lighting on migration is something I would be in favor of. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Anyone else? Operator, can you check to see if there's any?
No, you cannot speak again.
My name was invoked.
Is operator, is there anyone listening remotely that would like